Welcome back to another episode of Ready, Set, Bake, where I teach you guys how to make Instagram-worthy desserts at home, even if you may be a beginner. My name is Raeya, and in today's episode, we're going to be learning how to master these beautiful bento cakes together. We'll learn how to prepare the cakes, how to decorate 4 different designs, and how to package them perfectly, just like this one right here. Let's get started. The first step in making our bento cakes is to prepare the cake layers. There's so many different ways to make the cake layers, but my favorite way is using these mini cake pans. These are 4-inch cake pans, 4-inch rounds, and they are 2 inches in height, so they're perfect for cakes. What I like to do is I like to make a pretty thick layer and then cut the layer in half to make 2 different layers of cake. Some other great ways to do it, if you don't want to buy the cake pans, is to bake them in a sheet cake and use a cookie cutter to cut out little circles. Another great way to get your mini cake layers is to get a silicone mold with 4-inch rounds, and that way you can make a whole bunch of layers at the same time and they're all uniform and even in size. So let's get started. While my cake layers are cooling, I thought I would share a little bit about bento cakes with you, if you don't already know what they are. So bento cakes are adorable minimalist cakes that have taken the internet up by the storm, and rightfully so. Although they were first popularized in South Korea, they actually were said to originated in Japan during the Kamakura period in the 12th century. So the term bento in Japanese culture means convenient, and they refer to single-serving, small little lunches taken away in takeaway boxes. So that's what we're going to do for these cakes as well. Our cake layers have cooled, and now it's time to talk about decorating them. So since these cake layers are so small, they can be a little tricky to decorate since they can tend to move and slip around. So I thought I would share some of the supplies that I use to make the process a lot easier. So obviously you need your regular decorating supplies that you would normally use for a bigger cake, like a turntable, cake boards, an offset spatula, a bench scraper. I like to use this little tiny palette knife, which is actually used for painting, but this makes it a lot easier to replicate small designs on my cake. I also have some duct tape to stick the cake board onto my turntable. I also have these super small cake boards, which are about 2 inches bigger than my actual cake layers. And for this, you'll need a lot of different piping bags. I love how you can get super creative when decorating bento cakes. The sky's the limit. However, I'm going to show you a couple of my go-to designs today. So I have 1 cake layer here to prepare before we decorate it, and I've also made some buttercream. So I've talked about my buttercream a lot in my other episodes, and I always use a standard American buttercream. I find that it's super easy to make, it's great for beginners, and it holds up really well when decorating. So normally when leveling our cake layers, we would use a large serrated knife. But since this is just a small cake, I'm using a steak knife. And I know that sounds a little weird, but it has the perfect serrated edge and it's not too big. So I'm gonna go ahead and level my cakes like I usually do. So I'm taking my knife and you can see I'm going right below where the dome starts. And I'm making a nice cut all the way around. So right now I'm just scoring, I'm not cutting all the way through. And once that outline has made its way back to where we started, we can go ahead and cut all the way through. This just makes sure you're not cutting on a slant, so you get a nice, even cut. And you can see we've got the perfectly cut cake layer right here. And then I'm taking my knife again, and I'm actually going to tort the layer. Now what this means is we're cutting this one big layer into several different layers. So instead of having one big block of cake when you're trying to eat it, it's like a regular cake that has different layers on it. So we're gonna go ahead and score around. We're doing the exact same thing that we did when cutting off the dome, except we're just cutting it in half. So when we're decorating our cake, we're actually going to make the bottom with the nice flat edge our top of the cake. Now what this does is it creates a nice flat layer for us to decorate, and it also won't produce too many crumbs because it's not the raw edge that we just cut off. So now we can start to decorate. I'm using the duct tape that we had before and placing a small piece of tape onto our cake turntable. I'm taking my cake board and just placing it on there and using my spatula to put a little bit down. Now what this does is it sticks the cake to the cake board so it prevents slipping around. And then I'm placing my first layer of cake onto there. So you can fill your cake with so many different fillings. The options are endless. However, I would be careful to make sure your filling isn't too liquidy because then that can cause a bit of problems when you're decorating. So like a regular cake, I'm just gonna fill it. I'm gonna place a dollop of frosting into the center and use my spatula to spread it around. And then we're placing the second layer on top. So it's up to you if you want to do a crumb coat for your cake. I personally like to do it because it helps to get a cleaner look when you're decorating. So just like we would for a regular cake, we're basically decorating a regular cake here, except it's a lot smaller. And I'm just going to go ahead and spread some frosting on the top. And we want to make sure we're not getting any of the crumbs into our big batch of buttercream. So I'm just going to scrape it off on the side of the cake and grab some more. And once all of the frosting is evenly spread around the outside, we can go ahead, scrape off our spatula, and bring the edges in. Since it's such a small cake, it takes no time at all to get that crumb coat on there. Once we finish the crumb coat, this cake can go into the fridge for about 5 minutes to chill off before we do our final coat. And what this does is it makes this crumb coat cold enough that the crumbs won't be spread to our final coat. While it's in the fridge, I'm going to go ahead and crumb coat all of my other cakes to save some time, and we'll also start coloring our buttercream. And I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. I've crumb coated the rest of my cakes, and now it's time to color our frosting for the final coat. So I've said it before and I'll say it again, always use gel food coloring. You never want to use that liquid stuff, especially when you're working with frosting. Because first of all, gel food colorings are a lot more concentrated than that liquid stuff you get from your grocery store. And secondly, they do the job a lot better. You don't have to add loads of it into your frosting to get that super pigmented color. So I have my bowl here and I'm going to add a little bit of frosting into my bowl. We really don't need that much because they're such small cakes. So I'm just going to add about a 1/4 cup or a little more than a 1/4 cup into my bowl. I'm going to dye my frosting pink because the first design we're going to do is a sunset inspired cake. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit to start with because we can always add more. And I'm just going to give that a nice stir. After it's all mixed in, there's no streaks of unmixed color. I can see that it's a little bit too neon for my taste. So I have this cute burgundy food coloring. So I'm going to add a little bit of that into there to hopefully balance out the tones. And once again, just adding a little bit in because you can always add more, but you can never take away. And then just giving it another stir. So that seemed to do the trick. The burgundy darkened up the neon pink a little bit more, and I'm really happy with that shade. I also forgot to mention it during the crumb coat, but if you don't have those cake boards, you can also use a sheet of parchment to decorate on, and then you can just transfer that directly into your cake boxes. It's a little bit more difficult to decorate on parchment than it is on a cake board, especially since that cake board gives you that stability that parchment doesn't, but if you're in a pinch, it works just fine. Like I mentioned before, we're doing a sunset inspired design, which means we need a bunch of different shades. So whereas this pink is for our base coat, we're also going to need to make a large array of colors for that sunset look. So I'm going to put the bowl off to the side, and instead of using so many different bowls, I actually have a plate here, which we're going to use to mix small amounts of colors. I'm going to feel like a bit of a painter here doing this, but I'm going to make just small amounts of color and put them on opposite sides of the plate. And I'm going to use my palette knife to mix the colors in. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start off with a nice lilac color. So sunset has all different shades. You can either get a super yellowy, orangey sunset, or you can get a nice pink, purple, blue hue kind of sunset. So you can go for either one today, but I'm a sucker for pink, so I'm gonna go for that lovely pink sunset. and you can tell that it has a little bit of purple shades with a mixture of the blue from the sky and the purple clouds. And then I've also decided to make a little bit of yellow just for some contrast. And for this food coloring, you need a toothpick. So I'm just gonna go in and add a little bit. And then just give it a nice mix. I've brought my crumb-coated bento cake back from the fridge so we can put our final coat on there. So I'm taking my frosting, and we're basically just doing it like we would decorate a regular cake. So I'm adding a bunch on the top, and then we can spread it out to the sides. I'm using my offset spatula to spread the frosting along the top. So while I'm smoothing out the top, my spatula is staying still while I use the turntable to smooth out the top. We don't need to worry about the top or the sides being too smooth because the top is going to get covered with our sunset design and the sides are going to be covered with the parchment paper when we package them. I know with big cakes there's a pressure to get those flawless smooth sides, but with this one the main design is going to be at the top, so we don't have to worry about that too much. And now I'm using the extra frosting from the sides to bring them down to spread on the rest of the cake. My offset spatula is basically just smoothing back and forth to get nice coverage. Then after I see it's all covered nicely, I'm gonna go in with my bench scraper using the sharp edge on the bottom to line up with the bottom of my cake and smooth it out. These cakes are so small, we want to smooth rather than scrape all of the frosting out, because first of all, I made the frosting on the outside a little thinner than I usually would because I'm not worried about it being totally perfect, but also because the cakes are super small and they can easily move around. So we just want to be careful that we're not putting too much pressure so that the cake won't move. Now I'm just filling in any spots that have gaps in them. And then I'll repeat that until I'm happy with how the sides look. So the sides are completely covered and you can see it's not perfect, and like I said, it doesn't matter. And now we can smooth off the top. I'm going in with my offset spatula, I'm taking it and holding it directly above the cake. I'm making it level with the top so the sides aren't wonky. And I'm cutting in as I'm rotating my turntable. And then repeating that until we've gone all the way around the cake. Now that the top is smoothed out, this is going to go back in the fridge. So like I said, we're putting it back in the fridge between every step that we do so that in case we make a mistake, it's super easy to scrape off. I also find that it helps with the sunset design a little bit because you have more control where you're putting it and you can always take off any, like I said before. I brought my cake out of the fridge so now we can start decorating it. I always find it handy to have a little rag on the side so I can wipe off my spatula between if I don't want the colors to mix. So with that in mind, let's get started. I'm first going in with my purpley color, which is going to go at the top of the cake. So I'm working from the top and I'm going down. And what this will do, using this palette knife, is it's going to add a lot of texture to our cake. So instead of spreading it out, I like to kind of leave it rough, go to the edge of the cake, and smooth it out. And since my cake is cold, some of that purple frosting is already setting on there, even in just a couple of seconds of me spreading it around. So that way I can go ahead and add a little bit more texture if I need to. So you can see here I'm making a bit of a base before I add my texture to it. So I'm taking a bit of white. Feel free to blend the colors, you don't have to stick with it. I actually like to grab a little bit of both color on my palette knife, so when I smooth it, it's blending out. And that's just adding that nice base to it, and then we can go on top and add even more texture to it. So you can see I only have a little bit of purple. I actually want to add more of that color. Continuing to blend everything out as I add more layers, and that's just going to add even more dimension. So I'm just going in and adding some of those speckly colors in between. And that's gonna give us that really lovely sunset effect. You can see it's not a complete ombre. I'm adding in some purple in some odd places because that's just how a sunset is. It's pretty random at times. And even experiment using different spatulas for these larger areas. The larger spatula may be better if you're covering a large area of your cake. So that's just what I'm doing here. There's no one way to do it that's correct. Just find a method that works best for you. Now I'm going in and adding some of those yellow highlights to it. So I'm pretty happy with how this looks. So now we can go ahead and add our clouds to it. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a little bit of my white buttercream on my spatula. I'm going against my plate and just creating a little divot on there so I don't have too much. And I'm taking it against on the bottom of my cake and making a cloud. So I'm taking it and smudging it. And you don't want to smooth it out, you just want to smudge it to get that nice sharp design. And then I'm wiping it on my towel after every swipe that I do. So I'm just going to repeat that until I have the nice cloud design that I want. And instead of swiping down like that, I'm going on an angle so I get one edge that pokes out and one edge that's more smooth. I finished adding my little abstract cloud design to the cake, and now we can finish it off with a bit of writing. So I'm just using a piping tip 2, which is a very small round tip, and this is perfect for writing on cakes. You want to be mindful when choosing out piping tips for your bento cakes that they're a lot smaller than you would usually get for a regular sized cake. So I'm just cutting off the tip. And then putting my piping tip into my piping bag. I'm just gonna fold over the edge and fill it with some white frosting. Now that it's in the piping bag, we can start writing on our cake. If you watched my cookie cake episode, you'll know that I did a whole segment on how to write on your cakes, because I know it can be challenging for a lot of people, and it was even really intimidating for me when I first started decorating cakes. So you can write any message you want. I'm just gonna write peace on this cake because it's giving off very peaceful vibes. And you're gonna start by holding the piping bag in the way that feels most comfortable to you. So I like to hold it between my thumb and index finger. I twist the piping bag and wrap it around my hand. So once it's in that comfortable position, we can start writing on the cake. So I like to rest my forearm on the turntable, and that gives me stability so my hand isn't shaking around while I'm piping it out. Now that we finished decorating our first cake, we can move on to decorating our other ones. I'm so excited. So this next cake that we're gonna be doing is significantly easier to decorate. So if you found the sunset cake a little tougher to do, this is definitely the one for you. So I'm gonna go in with a blue theme. So I'm gonna separate some of my frosting into my bowl, and I'm gonna add my blue food coloring in. I'm loving this color, it's a super pretty blue shade. So now we can go ahead and do our final coat. So I'm bringing my cake back. I also have my bench scraper and offset spatula, and we're just gonna do the final coat like we would usually do. I'm finished with covering my cake. I've covered the sides, smoothed it out, and smoothed out the top as well. I'm happy with how it looks. Now here's the fun part. We're gonna create a bit of an abstract effect by doing some streaks of a different colored frosting on the outside. Now you can do whatever you want, but I'm gonna go for a blue and green theme. And I'm gonna bring back my palette knife here. So we're just gonna do some random streaks around the outside and on the top. So like I said, the sides aren't gonna show that much. It's just you'll see a little bit of peeking through the parchment when we package it up. So that's the only reason why. But you can go ahead and skip it and just do it on the top if you'd like. I'm happy with how that looks, and you can see when I was smoothing out the top, I have a bit of that overhang. So I'm just gonna go lightly around with my scraper to clean that up. And then I'll go in with my offset spatula just to cut off that edge. And I'm very lightly bringing it into the center just so that I don't ruin the design that I created. There, all done. Now we can go ahead and write our message. I'm using the same piping bag that I used from the last cake, and write whatever you like. And I'm using the same piping technique that I was also. So I'm gonna write ready, set, bake. So when I'm doing two-tone piping, I want a really clean look. So what I have here is some saran wrap or plastic wrap. I'm just laying it across my countertop. And I've got my two colors here. I've got my blue and my green, as well as a piping bag fitted with a tip 21. And that's a nice small star tip. So here, I want a clean look as possible. So I'm taking one color and placing it just on there and spreading it out a little bit. I'm going to take my second color and lie it right beside where I put my first color. So you can just separate your colors into a piping bag, but you're going to get a more blended out look. So if that's what you're going for, feel free to do that, but I find this is just a little bit more work, but it makes the most gorgeous swirl ever. And then we're gonna roll it up and make it into a little sausage. And I just like to twist the edges. It's a little frosting sausage, and we can cut one of the ends and put it into our piping bag. Before I start piping on my cake, I like to do a little test swirl in my bowl just to make sure both colors are coming out. And they are, it looks beautiful, so now we can start piping on our cake. Now that we finished piping out the border, I love how it looks. It's gorgeous, that lovely two-tone. We can go ahead and put our finishing touches. You can go with sprinkles, anything you want. I'm gonna use some edible glitter today. I'm using an edible glitter pump, and we're just gonna go and lightly spray all across the surface. And I'm gonna get some on the sides too. Now we can get started on our third design. The third cake design we're going to be doing today is a super fun inspired shag or rug cake, and it uses this tip. It's a 2-3-3 tip, and you can see it has these little indents. It looks really rough, but it creates that lovely grass effect. I only have one of these piping tips. So this is a little hack that you can do if you only have one piping tip, but you want to get the same design using the piping tip with 3 different colors. So here I have 3 different piping tips, and I have couplers. Now couplers allow you to switch between different piping tips without, switching the piping bags or taking a whole bunch of frosting out. So I'm just going to move my turntable over. And I'm going to put a coupler in each of my piping bags. I secured the couplers on the rest of my piping bags. Now what I love about this shag cake is that it uses up any leftover frosting that you may have. So this teal color here is what I used for the green and blue cake. And I've just mixed the 2 colors together, and it created this lovely color. I also have the pink frosting that was left over from my sunset cake. And I've just added a little bit of purple there to get a new shade. And then using my white buttercream, I colored it yellow. So now I'm gonna add each color in my piping bag. So now that I have all 3 of my piping bags filled up, I'm keeping the bowls on the side because I'm gonna show you what I'm gonna do with them. I'm taking my first color. You don't need any final coat on our cake. We just need the crumb coat because our frosting is gonna be thick enough to cover it. I'm gonna start with my first color. And this piping tip is a lot different than your normal piping tips. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna apply pressure, hold down and lift up, but I'm keeping a little bit of that pressure. So with this design, you can do any way you'd like. I'm just gonna do some random little blobs of colors around. So I'm gonna do a section of yellow all around the cake, and then I'm gonna switch my piping tip out, put it for another color, and fill in the rest. Now that I'm ready to switch to a different color, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unscrew the cap from the coupler and remove my piping tip. Now you'll still see you have some yellow frosting in there, but what we're going to do next is going to take away all of that yellow. I'm going to go in with my next color. I'm going to use the purple. Put the piping tip on and then screw it in. And I'm going to take my yellow bowl and pipe out all of that yellow frosting until we see purple. So what this does is instead of having the colors blend out on the cake, you're getting that solid color. And we're putting it back into the yellow bowl so none of that frosting goes to waste in case you need some extra. Removed all of the yellow frosting. I see only purple, there's no streaks of yellow, so now we can do our other sections of the cake. So I'm just going to continue piping on the cake until everything is filled up. I finished all of my piping on my cake. I love how it turned out. It really does look like a rug in the best way possible. And now let's move on to our next design. So the last cake we're going to be decorating today is a really cute flower-inspired cake. To make our cake, I have 3 different piping bags here. I have one filled with white frosting, yellow frosting, and black frosting. The piping bag filled with white frosting has a medium round tip. This is a number 12 tip. The one with yellow frosting has a bit of a smaller tip than the white one. It's a number 10 tip. And then the black one here has a really, really tiny tip. This is a 00 tip. So if you can imagine that, and you can compare the number 12 and the number 00, you can see that this one is super small. You can barely see the hole, but don't worry, it's not that hard to pipe out. It's for the really small details. So you can see on this cake, I've actually left the raw edge here. And I really like that for designs that are less busy and you need that extra bit of pizzazz to it. So using our white frosting, I'm going to create 5 petals because we're creating a flower. So on one end of the cake, I'm going to squeeze and then bring it into the center. Now I'm on the 5th petal, so you can see I've left enough room to make all 5 petals. And I've finished that. So I'm going to make a bunch of those, as many as I can, on the cake. Once I've finished adding on all of my petals and flowers, we can go in with the yellow tip and create a circle in the middle of each one. We're creating really cute daisies here. Now that I've added all of my daisies on there, we can go in with our black frosting and make some smiley faces. This is optional, I just think it looks really cute. And once we've added the smiley faces on the daisies, the cake is done. It's as simple as that. Now we can get started on our packaging. gotten all of these cakes into the boxes, it's super easy. Now all we have to do is attach the twine like I did on this one, and I used a piece of washi tape to stick a candle and a little spoon on there. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Ready, Set, Bake, and I'll see you next time.